Many people in and outside of the publishing industry are asking the question, can self-published indie authors compete with traditionally published authors? Once upon a time, it seemed impossible. But now, with the quality of traditionally published novels plummeting, seems like publishers are chasing what will sell over what's actually good. That's capitalism, baby. And indie books increasing in quality due to the amount of online DIY information and resources available. The answer is yes, self published authors can compete and are competing with traditional publishers. And Drew Harrison's The Men of the Mountain is a mountain of an example. Strap in for one of my most positive indie reviews yet, and potentially a new high score. See, I wrote this part before figuring out my ratings and I didn't go back to change it. So let's see if I was right. New high score incoming. Maybe. No writing advice. Before I dish out some ratings, what's the story? The Men of the Mountain, not to be confused with The Man of the Mountain, Mountain Man's Sugar, or Double Dirty Mountain Men. Yeah, if you don't add the author's name to your Amazon search, you get some interesting results. Anyway, The Men of the Mountain, what's the story? Our protagonist, Cade Clanless, is a member of a somewhat primitive group of village people known as the Wren, who are ruled by the Men of the Mountain, also known as the Green Robes, a bunch of godlike humans who wear green robes to, I don't know, seem more mystical and godlike, I guess. A few years back, the Green Robes took Cade's sister, Adria, and he hasn't heard from her since, concerning. At this point, Cade's had an absolute gutful, and he's determined to find out where his sister is. But then a mysterious woman falls from the sky, and Cade's problems only get bigger. Mountainous, you could say. All right, let's get into the ratings. Straight up, I give the world building a mind-blowing 4.5 out of 5. Now, when I do reviews, I try not to give any details that aren't in the blurb, and a lot of the world building is centered around the secrets of the Men of the Mountain, which are revealed gradually throughout the story. Yes, world building details are trickled in nicely throughout the narrative, so you never feel overwhelmed with information overload. Wren society itself is interesting and well developed within the story. It's even more interesting once you learn who and what they are and why the Men of the Mountain rule over them. They have specific beliefs and customs that give their society a certain level of depth and believability. Yes, they're a believable bunch of village folk. Without saying too much, their origin and the origin of their overlords are a critical part of the story, and while there are more questions than answers at the start, a clearer picture does gradually form. The mixing of cultures with different levels of, let's say, power is done well, and it makes sense that the Men of the Mountain have been able to maintain their rule over the Wren for so long. There's also a non-human race known as the Krieger. They're humanoid creatures that can regenerate themselves and heal injuries. They also have an interesting origin story. It's just, yeah, all the world building details are interconnected in a satisfying way, and that interconnectedness becomes more evident as the story progresses. My one issue with the world building is sometimes it seems like the Men of the Mountain's abilities are inconsistent with perceived reality. I'm trying not to spoil anything here, so let's just say this. It makes sense that the Green Robes can keep the Wren in line. It also makes sense that they might underestimate the Wren, putting the Green Robes in a position to get caught off guard if there's ever a revolt. But it's a little unclear why they seem to have so much power in some areas, but not others. I mean, once they realise the Wren might be a threat, you'd expect them to use their full power to stop them. And I'm not talking about destructive power, they've got that covered. They just seem impotent in other areas, which doesn't match the level of power you know they have. All right, did I get through that without spoiling anything? Look, it's a minor point that you could explain with some mental gymnastics, but at certain points I couldn't help but wonder, why are they holding back? Maybe it's a character flaw, but not as flawed as that clumsy segue. I give the characters in The Men of the Mountain a solid 4 out of 5. There are so many great characters and character moments. Cade himself gets a nicely executed character arc. He's repeatedly challenged throughout the narrative, fueling that all important character development. He's an extremely active protagonist. I'll discuss the overarching theme in the storytelling section, but at its core, The Men of the Mountain is a story about choice, and Cade is frequently forced to make tough decisions. There's plenty of internal conflict to accompany the external. He's rarely passive, and there's a constant forward momentum for his character and the plot in general. Cade also has clear motivations, which he acts on. That part's important. Initially, he just wants to find his sister, but he's forced to adapt to changing circumstances and his goals become loftier. Yes, he has bigger mountains to climb. Being a rabbit trapper, he's believably competent when it comes to navigating the regions outside of the Wren village, and even his most ridiculous actions have a certain logic behind them, I guess. My main issue with Cade doesn't appear until the epilogue. The story's pretty much over at that point, and he's been tested many times, so you know what type of person he is. Once again, tough to discuss without spoilers, but the choice he makes, what he decides to do at the end of the story, after the story's done, seems kind of cruel, which doesn't fit his character. You could make assumptions and arguments for his decision, but because the decision-making process takes place off-page, you don't know his actual thought process. The scene's so jarring because Cade becomes predictable by the end of the story. You do know his thought process, so you can guess what he'll do. That's not a bad thing for a character. It means his actions are in character for most of the story. But in the epilogue, his actions are surprising and not in an, oh yeah, that makes sense. Cade's main Wren companions, Helga and Fortin, develop nicely and each have their big moments. There are a bunch of minor characters who are also well constructed, and some, like Wayne Porter, get their own interesting little character arcs within the story. Everyone gets challenged in their own ways. Overall, in The Men of the Mountain, there's a lot of great character work. I did find Robin, the woman who falls from the sky, a little flat, but that might be due to her not speaking the Wren language, so her characterization doesn't come through as strongly. She's a critical character and she knows it, and she's meant to be intelligent, but she comes across as oddly impractical at times, almost suicidal. Look, the character works, but it seems like there's so much beneath the surface that isn't revealed, which makes her seem less three-dimensional than some other characters. Let's talk villains. The Green Robes and their leader, the Archwarden, are believable enough antagonists. The Archwarden maybe pushes the limits of believability a bit, but the angle for that character is creative enough to earn a pass. I do find it strange that the Men of the Mountain all seem unified in their beliefs, even though there is some doubt and internal conflict there. But, you know, even big corporations have the occasional whistleblower, but not among the Green Robes. They run an airtight ship. There's a similarly odd unification among the Wren at a certain point. I mean, once again, I'll try not to drop any spoilers, but if you're asking an oppressed people to rebel against their so-called gods, even in extreme circumstances, I'd expect some resistance from certain people in any group, but on both sides, everyone seems oddly unified. Yeah, we're cool with everything that's going on here. Some of it is earned on the Wren side as Cade demonstrates his leadership qualities, but no one wins everyone over like that. It would have felt more natural to have more conflict between characters on both sides. There is some in places, but nothing meaningful. Do you know what is meaningful? The storytelling. Yes, my segues know no shame. I give the storytelling, and this was a tough one because I have a lot of notes, almost equal positives and negatives. The tough part was deciding how much weight to give each point. After crunching the numbers and crunching my brain, I've decided to give the storytelling another mind-blowing 4.5 out of 5. Here's how I got there. Firstly, The Men of the Mountain is expertly structured. I've read quite a few unconventionally structured stories over the last year or so it is refreshing to read a book that's structured in a satisfying way. For the record, I'm not against breaking convention if it enhances a story, but with many of the books I'm thinking of, it's more a case of sloppy storytelling than deliberate action, I think. In The Men of the Mountain, the plot flows nicely from start to finish, and overall, it's well paced. There are some some lulls in tension that almost drag on a little too long, but they're always followed up with tenser sequences and big revelations, and the overall stakes and tension are constantly escalating and building towards the climax. Plenty of setups with all the payoffs delivered, and the ending wraps up the story nicely. Yes, finally a novel that contains a complete story. It's a miracle. It shouldn't be, but it is. I'm giving extra weight to endings for better or worse, and here we do get the complete storytelling package. The Men of the Mountain actually tells two stories side by side. The main plot focuses on Cade, and then the story of Tabula Rasa accompanies that. The second story adds flavour and acts as a vehicle for some of the philosophical and psychological commentary that's woven into the narrative. As I mentioned, there's a strong theme around the power of choice and responsibility, which it's a little heavy-handed in places, but I do think that's better than having a weaker theme that fades into the background and isn't noticed. One minor issue I have with the storytelling is, and I don't give this much weight because it's almost unavoidable, but because we know more of the big picture than Cade does, the emotional impact of some of the revelations is lost. Cade's frequently having his mind blown, but for reasons that will make sense if you read the book, we can put the pieces together quicker. It's not a huge problem because there are plenty of reveals you don't see coming. It's just that the wider will. All right, I'm gonna start it again. Am I capable of speaking words? Let's find out. It's not a huge problem because there are plenty of reveals you don't see coming. It's just that the wider world building elements are easier for us as readers to grasp than they are for Cade. There are also some actions from Cade and his companions that seem unnecessarily risky, and it's probably more of a character issue. Look, it makes sense for characters under pressure to make dumb decisions, but some of their actions made me shake my head. Why take such big risks? In some scenes, there's a lot riding on luck, but overall, The Men of the Mountain is a prime example of how to structure a story in a compelling and satisfying way. More satisfying than this segue into the writing category. The writing, I give a 4 out of 5. It's great. Not perfect, but better than a lot of what I've read lately. The prose is simple yet evocative. Descriptions aren't mind-blowing, but they are nicely detailed. And figurative language is grounded and enhances clarity instead of reducing it. Yes. I did listen to the audiobook and I didn't notice many editing mistakes or oversights. I did notice the occasional bit of repetition and some sentences could be tighter. Minor stuff. I wrote down a couple of examples where there's some redundancy. These aren't hard critiques, by the way. I just want to demonstrate how a passable sentence can be made better. We'll do this one. It's perhaps the most I've ever heard the old woman say to me. With the redundant words, mainly heard, the sentence almost implies the older woman says things to him he doesn't hear. Hey, maybe she does, but to tighten up a sentence like that, cut the fluff and just say, it's perhaps the most the older woman has ever said to me. The heard is implied. There are also some cliche lines, not many, just the occasional one. For example, at one point, Cade's legs are as heavy as lead. How many times have you heard that phrase? So look, for context, I gave the writing a 4. I don't normally get to dish out more than a 3.5. I can't even think of many others where I have been able to give a 4 or above. Spin Trap for sure. But anyway, my point is, overall, The Men of the Mountain is a well-written story with philosophical and psychological insights and a thought-provoking theme expertly woven into the narrative, which is one factor in my overall enjoyment, which I give another mind-blowing 4.5 out of 5. I really enjoyed The Men of the Mountain. The plot moves forward at a steady pace and characters are frequently challenged and placed in impossible situations. There's also a steady flow of reveals and payoffs and some great character moments. It feels like you're getting value with every chapter. That's how it should be. There are some tedious moments, but the less tense, slower paced scenes and sequences are necessary in the wider context of the narrative. As a complete package, The Men of the Mountain does so much right. Speaking of doing things right, another factor in my overall enjoyment is the top-tier audiobook production and narration from L. Connor McGervely. Great delivery, plenty of little nuances that enhance the performance, and there's even some music. Drew has a video on TikTok, I believe it was TikTok, that shows the production process for the music. It's worth checking out if you're interested in that. I just got so excited about the audiobook just then that I spilt tea on my white shirt. So anyway, moving on. Before we move on to the final score, I do have one big complaint that did affect my overall enjoyment. Some of the action scenes are a little too cartoonish for my liking. The story overall is fairly grounded, but some of the action pushes the limits of believability. I thought about this a lot, and none of it's so ridiculous that I could justify taking points off the storytelling rating, but some of the absurdity did affect my overall enjoyment a bit. Look, overall, the story's well written, well executed, and super creative, even if I'm not sold on the epilogue. That leaves the Men of the Mountain with a record-breaking 4.3 out of 5. Yes, it's a new high score. I haven't been using a rating system for long, but few, if any, of the traditionally published books I've reviewed would have achieved a score so high. The verdict is in. Self-published books are finally not just matching, but exceeding the quality of traditionally published books. I mean, even the cover looks professional. Look at that. Amazing. Now I'm nervous about the next few books on the submission list, because now the bar has been set mountain high. If you enjoyed this video, hit subscribe. If you didn't enjoy this video, hit subscribe anyway and hate watch my content. That's always fun.